Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second session of our webinar series on the legal foundations and strategic structuring of lease financing, produced by the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission. Again, I'm Robert Berry, the Executive Director here at CDIAC. In today's session, our intention is to explore the risks, realities, and market preferences of lease financing decisions. You remember in our last session, we enjoyed a tour through the history of leases and built an understanding of how present-day lease financing has developed as a very important and consistently utilized public finance tool in California. We learned about the Supreme Court cases that ensconce the legal principles that form the foundation of what we've called the legal construct, or a legally valid exception to the constitutional debt limit in California. And our faculty explained how development and maintenance of the lease construct requires the inclusion of certain compulsory structural elements. But even in the discussion of compulsory elements like fair rental value and abatement, we learned there's unsettled aspects and that conventions may guide financing decisions when the strict guidance of the law departs. What our presenters conducted in session one was, in effect, a process of categorizing the structural elements of financing leases into those that are legally required and those that result from business decisions where the issuer has levels of discretion. In doing so, we're now in the position in this session to explore more deeply those discretionary elements and the various implications of different courses of action. So we're set up for a very interesting discussion that will challenge conventions born of our collective assumptions of what rating agencies and investors want to see, and that age-old excuse of, well, we've always done it that way. This will not be a didactic session, but rather a Q&A discussion type program where our presenters will provide the benefit of their deep experience in lease financing to answer many of those questions that we didn't even know to ask. At the conclusion of this session, we hope to give you the confidence to challenge conventions and explore your options more fully to improve the overall value of your next lease financing transaction. So before I introduce our faculty team, I need to again cover the standard webinar housekeeping items. So again, the slides for this session and last session and links to our lease financing content series are posted to the event page on the CDIAC website. You can get that from our front page on our website or at the link listed on the screen. Questions are submitted through Slido, again, on the Q&A tab. If you do not see the Slido app come up on your screen, there is a link in the chat that will allow you to access the Q&A. So we're really hopeful that you will take part in this discussion by submitting questions anytime during the program. We'll also have a couple of polls today during the program, so use the polls tab in the Slido app to submit your responses to the poll questions as they appear. If you'd like captioning, there's a captioning button in the lower left of the screen. If you participate in 70% of the webinar, we will send you a certificate of attendance. We'll also make a full replay available in our education portal in a couple of weeks. And then if you are having any technical problems, visit the link on the screen to WebEx to solve some of those technical issues. So now I will welcome and introduce our four distinguished faculty presenters for today's session. Each of these folks has been a longtime supporter of CDIAC, veterans of numerous educational programs for CDIAC, and contributors to our publications. And so we're really lucky to have them all with us here today. First, we have Margaret Backstrom, Managing Director and Co-Head of Public Sector Banking for Morgan Stanley's Public Finance Department, based in San Francisco with over 27 years of experience. As a public finance investment banker, Margaret is a recognized expert in a wide variety of bond structures and credits, having senior managed more than $40 billion in financings for many of the largest public sector issuers in the Western U.S. Also joining us is Melissa Schick, Municipal Advisor at K&N Public Finance. Melissa's expertise has been built from 20 years of combined public sector, public finance investment banking, and municipal advisory experience. With K&N, Melissa advises a diverse mix of agencies across the public sectors and is experienced in structuring and leading financing for various credit types, including lease revenue bonds. Next, we welcome Anna Van Degna, Public Finance Director for the City and County of San Francisco. In her role, Anna oversees the issuance of all new debt secured by property taxes and general fund sources, initiates the city's debt policies and procedures, and provides technical expertise for the preparation and monitoring of the city's 10-year capital plan. Then returning as our moderator today is Dan Deaton, partner with Nixon Peabody. Dan is in the public finance group of Nixon Peabody, where he represents governmental agencies, nonprofits, underwriters, and others as disclosure, underwriters counsel, and underwriters counsel in a wide variety of public finance transactions. So Dan will get us started with a review of what we covered in session 1. Dan?
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. For folks who were not on the webinar or who were and now cannot remember what we talked about, a week ago Tuesday, David Brosley of K&N, Melissa's colleague, John Palmer of ORIC, and I had a good conversation about the various legal parameters that we live in terms of lease revenue bond financing and the lease exception itself under the California Constitution and how the Supreme Court has crafted that. And we discussed the evolution of that and how we basically have a Supreme Court crafted, policy crafted space for us to do our lease revenue bond deals and our lease deals that allows us to not worry about whether or not a city or a county or a school district or the state is violating the debt limit. And that lease exception, broadly stated, as we talked about last time, requires there to be a leased asset that has what the court referred to as fair rental value, and also ensures that there are provisions in the lease that ensure that if the use and occupancy of that asset is interfered with and that cannot be used, that rent on that is abated. What we also talked a lot about last time is the evolution of this over time and how from the issuer's perspective, this moved from a very new thing and trying to figure out how to kind of create something that hadn't been created before, and that particularly in the aftermath of Proposition 13, how this proliferated, and then after Ryder versus City of San Diego, really trying to make sense as to what the structure of this should look like from a legal perspective. But today what we want to do is move to the other side of the lines where lawyers can't go, where lawyers can inform, lawyers can identify the issues, lawyers can share their experience, but in the end, today we want to talk about what's not legal. And what we mean by that is what are the financial decisions and the financial positions that local agencies need to be thinking through as they do lease revenue bond financings, COP financings that are based on the lease revenue exception, or even leases that they might enter into in one form or another. And I think that what we talked about last week was how that we have this legal space that we have, but that what really has developed over the last, call it 20 years, has been change within the markets as to how these transactions are being affected within the market, number one. Learning about, for example, the bankruptcy treatment of how this would work within the Stockton bankruptcy and what to be evaluating for that. And then at the end, really trying to sort of say, where do we as an industry stand today in terms of what are the right points of flexibility for local agencies that will still end up with appropriate market acceptance, getting deals done at the price levels that we want them to be done. How do we look at our leased assets in that regard? How do rating agencies and investors look at these products? And how do we understand the risks that we might encounter as we manage and maintain these programs, and so on. And so for that, we have the group of folks that we have on today to discuss these issues. Trista, if you go next slide. So the first question that we really want to grapple with for a while, and this might be the longest question that we talk about today, which is, what are some of the challenges that issuers face in getting a lease financing deal done? And for that, Trista, do we want to go to our first polling question? I think we have one participant. Here we go. Two. Okay, I think we've hit a critical. It's interesting that, and I think I would have to say, that this actually falls not that far off of what our preparations with this actually were discussing in terms of what we were anecdotally experiencing ourselves. So it's an interesting ranking that the polling gives there. So Trista, if you go back to the last slide, that would be great. So let me start off with Melissa on this question in terms of leased assets. Melissa, could you just generally describe what are you encountering in terms of issuers, in terms of overall, how often are they running into challenges getting enough assets to do their deals, and what do they do when they face constrained assets when they do encounter those problems?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think that is certainly the biggest challenge as we think about lease financings. For the smaller agencies, they simply may just be asset constrained given the size of their organization and having less assets within a smaller city or smaller population. Whereas some of the larger issuers that we work with who have really active lease financing programs, they may have broad and diverse asset base and facility base, but it's a matter of many of those assets may already be encumbered on an existing frequent program. So, we typically work with our clients reviewing a list of assets within a city's county or other governmental agency portfolio, determine which assets are encumbered, which assets may be unencumbered, and then from there, consider things like the age of the asset and the asset life, and its ability to serve as a reasonable basis for a lease property on a transaction. And then we also look at essentiality, and all of these topics we'll get into in more detail. But in the absence of asset availability, um, or sufficient value to serve as the lease property on a transaction, we sometimes look to utilizing the project that's being financed through the issuance as an alternative mode for seeking value and having an asset assigned to the transaction. So Dan, I pulled up a number of topics in that response, and I know we'll get into each of them in more
Yeah.
detail, but that's kind of broadly speaking in terms of how we start the asset discussion with our clients.
Yeah, and let me ask you a question. I mean, how often do you find that set selection ultimately materially changes the financing structure? And how often, as people encounter they look in the next 5 years, how often does it look like this is going to have a good likelihood of changing financing structures for some issuers? How often does that happen, would you say?
I would say pretty frequently, first and foremost, in thinking about a transaction, the asset discussion ends up being the first item that we address
Mhm.
because that does drive structure, Dan. And as existing assets may not be available, that is when a structure, may change because we may have to use the project that's being financed, which then implies a capitalized interest component on the structure. Some agencies have a master lease structure whereby there's a number of assets that are leased on a transaction, which allows for the issuance of additional bonds to leverage the value of that pool of assets. But if as that pool of assets is becoming more leveraged over time, that may then require an alternative structure, adding additional assets or issuing under a separate lease structure. So certainly, things change over time. I will say too, as an agency has a broader capital program, and as they use lease revenue bonds to finance facilities and projects, once those facilities are financed and constructed, sometimes we replace or substitute those in on leases. So there tends to be kind of like a lag and a catch up. And I know Daniel will speak to some of the dynamics around substitution and replacement of assets further in the discussion.
Yeah, great. And Anna, let me turn to you. Like, how has how have you faced asset selection over time, and how has it changed for you? And what is it that are the challenges that you feel like you face when you have to choose different assets?
Sure. I think one of the challenges that we face is just looking at the variety of assets that the city has and what the investors may deem as essential or non-essential, and also the rating agencies. So I think essentiality is definitely a factor in when we select our leased assets. There's also we'll look at potentially what are the costs. Costs are always a factor, but we've had a situation whereby for one particular lease revenue bond, the cost of property insurance were really kind of increasing like over 20% per year for multiple years. And it was just getting, for a very small transaction, to be a very high portion of the overall, not just base rental, but plus additional rental, very high. And so that was a situation in which, we worked with our risk management division and our library department, kind of went through the substitution process. The other times that we will, maybe look to change leased assets if we're embarking on a refinancing, and it might be a refinancing of an asset that was since a standalone COP or lease revenue bond, and we may look to bring that into our master lease, which, sometimes if we're looking at essentiality or thinking about essentiality, we can bring a less essential asset into a master lease, and that might be another kind of choice in our structuring and choosing lease assets.
Yeah, and so from your perspective, following the polling question, you're kind of like basically following, you sort of like, I think you just listed 4 out of 5 of the challenges as ones that you regularly are encountering as you have to make those decisions. And so it's, and how does the sort of playing the chessboard down work for you as well? Like, in other words, don't you have to like look over some future period, understand the financing needs over that period, and be moving the assets around in a way that makes sure that you don't get boxed in one form or another?
Yes, so there's a list of kind of leased assets along with their valuations that the real estate department maintains and we monitor, and we're kind of constantly looking at that, our future new money needs, and looking to ensure that we've got proper lead time if we do want to bring one of those assets into the portfolio, or if we know of certain transaction sizes that might be coming up in a year or 2 years. We'll look at that that list of lease assets and think about priorities of what to choose. We're lucky right now that we have a lot of lease assets to choose. The city might not always be in that situation.
Okay, great. And Margaret, let me turn it to you. And like, what's the investor perspective as an underwriter? Like, what advice do you have for local agencies about how to kind of look at leased assets from an investor's perspective? And how has the investor perspective changed over time on this, as best you can kind of describe it?
Yeah, thanks. I would say that there are clearly a large variety of different types of leased assets that have been used by issuers in California. Everything from city hall to libraries, parks, undeveloped land, streets, convention centers. So there is a precedent for a large variety. Investors do tend to look at the essentiality. And I actually think that the August 2025 CDIAC report that kind of gives this spectrum of different assets and their essentiality is pretty good in terms of like what investors prefer, and investors preferring things on the more essential side of that. Although I would say, and I know we're going to get into some of this conversation later, I would say that some of the assets that may be deemed less essential, like a park or undeveloped land or a corporate yard or something like that, may be less at risk for abatement. So, or some of the other, and may have a lower property or a lower other kind of insurance cost to them. So I do think it's important for each issuer to look at the available assets and have a conversation with their municipal advisor and their underwriter and their attorneys and figure out what makes the most sense, given that there are kind of pushes and pulls, and whether an investor may want City Hall, but if City Hall is too expensive in terms of insurance, then it may make more sense to come together, bring some other assets into the mix, despite, an investor preference.
Okay, great. And one last question in terms of this line of questioning. Melissa, sort of like when you look at, we're talking about how to pick a leased asset with the financial objectives that are in case, but how are some ways that involving an asset into a deal can actually impact the operations of the government? In other words, what they do on an everyday basis. And that's, I think, an important consideration, that how does this affect how they live their lives?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And, sometimes that's not entirely apparent at issuance and when we're putting the deal together. And so remember, we're choosing a lease property at the time of issuance in the security structure, but we issue 30-year bonds or 20-year bonds for longer term capital projects. So 10 years, 20 years down the road, that the asset that we may have leased to the transaction may be needed for other purposes. And so, I think as we think about the consideration of leasing an asset on a transaction, really looking at flexibility around the release and substitution of that asset is just super important. I have one client that I'm currently working on a release of an asset that had previous been leased to one of their lease revenue bond series. And that asset is part of a broader kind of campus redevelopment and a relook at a master plan of their facilities. And ultimately, that asset is going to be demolished and destructed for broader facility plans of this agency. So they will have to release the asset and substitute it with another asset because they need it for other purposes. And then I don't know, Dan, and we've talked about this previously, but at the start of a transaction, I do think it's worthwhile for that question to raise the question, like, is it appropriate to lease City Hall, right? And do we need this for other purposes? And we'll get to relet in the discussion there, but I know, Dan, you and I have had this discussion before, right, with a mutual client is as we're thinking about assets at the start, knowing and understanding that it's a 30-year lease and we don't know what may come up over time, um, you know, there is just the fundamental question at the start, like, is this the asset that I want to encumber at this particular time? And is it a reasonable asset to do so? Um, and sometimes the more essential the asset, the less flexible operationally that is for, a city or a county. Actually, probably most times.
Yeah, and by the way, those are very awkward internal conversations that I've had before, that if you include an asset into a lease revenue bond, you're not allowed to demolish it. And those have been awkward conversations. It is a rule. It's like pretty important that you don't destroy the building. And like you said, I think, and Anna, let me just kind of pick up on that a little bit. What from your perspective are assets that are just policy-wise off limit? And I'm curious about how tone deaf is the municipal bond market about that? I mean, I think that's a key question. How tone deaf from, well, but if there's no right of relet and if there's other types of deals, why does it matter if we lease the crown jewels of the city? I mean, what's off limit, and how tone deaf are we as an industry about it?
I started at the city 8 years ago, and I remember when I started, people, mentioning to me, we don't talk about using City Hall as a leased asset. I can't imagine going to, the mayor, the board of supervisors, and suggesting that, a place where we come to work every day, and that's just such an iconic part of San Francisco. So certainly, I think there's certain assets that are kind of just off the list unless maybe they really need to be for some reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that it at the end of the day, it's the issuer itself that has to defend that. I mean, meaning that one of the biggest problems that we can encounter as a municipal securities industry is that we can, let the tail wag the dog, and that in the end, we're trying to get the best financing that we can for cities and counties, but we need to remember that cities and counties don't exist to do financing. Right? They exist for their general welfare and the purposes that they're doing. And when that crosses that policy line, it needs to be the issuer that stands up and says, this is essential to our mission, and this facility is essential to our mission, and this is a line we cannot cross, or very extraordinary things need to be in that sense. So Margie, let me ask you about, like, when you have assets that are uniquely exposed to earthquake risk, flood risk, or wildfire risk, I mean, I think, could you comment on, I mean, there's been a lot of recent stuff over the last couple of years on this, as we've dealt with, and how do you look at assets? How should local agencies look at assets that are exposed to these unique kinds of risks as they approach the investment community?
Yeah, I mean, we have been, as Californians, impacted by this over the years in terms of, and investors' questions, in my experience, tend to vary a lot with the news cycle. So in the last year, we've gotten more and more questions about wildfire risk than in my previous experience. So investors are very focused on these types of risks and what kind of what they may be exposed to. And I think for the issuers, I think the important things are disclosing as much information as you can about the asset. Is it in a floodplain? Is it like what are some of the hardening measures that have been taken with respect to the asset? Because investors may ask those questions, and obviously if it's not in your disclosure, then we can't communicate that information to them. But it also brings up, and I know we're going to talk a lot about insurance later, is what is the insurance, what are the insurance requirements on that asset? I know, and I'm not aware of any, there might be one or two, but any clients who have earthquake insurance, just given the cost of it, it's not a reasonable cost. So for an issuer to agree to provide, and so so it's finding that balance, explaining what the risks are to investors, what information you're aware of, but then also finding that balance with the insurance and the mitigating factors, I would say.
And how often have you experienced it where you felt like that risk actually led to a more expensive financing for the issuer? How often do you find that to occur?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to quantify, right? Because there may be investors that decide, for example, we were hearing from investors that certain investors don't participate in lease financings after some kind of high profile bankruptcies 10 and 15 years ago, because those investors may have gotten spent a lot of money in legal fees trying to fight it out with to get paid on those lease revenue bonds. We are also finding that certain investors decided that they were not going to make any investments in lease revenue bonds in the entire Los Angeles basin. So, so a 8-county or 5-county area that they were just not comfortable. And so a lot of the times you're dealing with investors who are based not in these areas. And so what they're exposed to is the news cycle. And so it's our job as underwriters to educate investors and let them know all the mitigating factors, all the insurance that our clients carry, and get them the best price available. And so it's hard to say, like, we have very successful transactions, but does one investor deciding not to participate impact the cost? Well, probably not, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, but it sounds like most of your counsel with your experience would be, don't necessarily exclude those assets, but be prepared from a disclosure perspective and from an agreement perspective to be effective at answering those questions, as opposed to excluding the assets themselves. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, that's absolutely fair.
Yeah, good. Anna, let me turn to you in terms of the next question that we have, which is the valuations. And can you describe how the City and County of San Francisco goes about coming up with its evaluation of fair rental value?
Sure. For us in the Office of Public Finance, we work with the Director of Property in the Real Estate Division. So under the city's admin code, the Director of Property is responsible for determining the value of the city's assets. The director may choose to work with a team in-house or potentially outsource the work and work with a third-party appraiser. I've seen both since I've been here, but probably more frequently working with his own or their own team of experts.
Melissa, how do other people kind of, well, let me ask you also a question, Anna. What are some challenges that you encounter by going about it in that way? Like, in other words, is that what are some frustrations that you have in the process that you follow in that regard? None.
I think, just generally, working in city government, you just want to make sure whoever you're working with has enough lead time to perform the work. So, we like to give folks as much advance notice as possible, whether we're working with our risk management division or real estate division or other departments in the city, just making sure folks have enough lead time to do the work and think about it would be our
Yeah, and so it's a
priority.
fair comment to say that in your experience, the challenge that you've had with valuations is not pondering the great metaphysical question about what the value is, but actually just doing the wood chopping of making sure that you have enough advance notice to people so they can do the work that they need to do so you don't run into a problem with your financing schedule. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes. And that's why I mentioned
Yeah,
earlier.
and I think,
Go ahead. Just having the list of leased assets that we're periodically reviewing when we're planning for a future issuance.
yeah, and that's consistent with my experience that as much as people want to talk about the great metaphysical question, that 90% of the time it comes down to just logistics. It really doesn't come down to some complex question. Melissa, how do other people approach valuation?
Yeah, and I'll say K&N has the benefit to work with the city and county of San Francisco, and I will say their approach is the super gold standard. But that's not the case with, this city's a large agency, and with some of the smaller agencies we work with, they simply just don't have the resources of a broad real estate department. And so sometimes the path is reaching out to appraisers and getting kind of a third party opinion on valuations. But then some is just done, in-house in terms of being reliant on insured values, like what the facilities, at what level they're insured at. And and looking at valuations, we look at not only the value of the actual facility, but also the underlying land in which the facility is on. And in that capacity, there can be different approaches to valuing the land, which is done either in-house and, kind of a cost per square feet type of approach, or looking at market comps in terms of the land value. But that also can be picked up in the third-party appraisals.
Great. And how often do you run into assets that just really that are so unique and so weird that it's really hard to value them? How often do you run into that?
Yeah, I would say maybe not as frequent, Dan, and maybe some of that wood gets chopped, at Anna's level, right? And working with your internal real estate department. But we do try in selecting assets to the extent, there is a kind of a pool of available assets. We do try to kind of leverage the more straightforward assets, right? But even on, like, I'm just thinking like a maintenance yard, right? That particular the facilities or the buildings there may simply just not produce a lot of value, but the underlying land is what ends up really driving the value on the asset. So it could be tilted, one way or another depending on the type of asset you're looking at.
Okay, great. Margie, what's the investor view on any of this? Like, as a banker, what's your experience with these questions, and what should issuers be thinking about from your perspective about valuation, how you value these leased assets?
Yeah, I would say investors don't focus a lot on the actual value. They rely on um, the fact that the law requires fair rental value in excess of the lease payment. So they um, they don't focus. My experience is that we don't get a lot of questions on actual valuations. We get more questions on what we've already discussed, which is essentiality and like kind of the risk profile of any given asset.
Dan, can we jump
Okay,
in?
great.
Like, I think that's a super interesting point, and I know, Dan, we've discussed this recently on issuer disclosure, right? And
Mhm.
we do
Right.
all the background work on valuation from a legal perspective, right? But as we think about issuer disclosure, at what point are the value that has been determined, is that of something that we should be disclosing to the market? And I know you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, and I think it's putting the legal side of the legal dimension of that to the side for this panel for a little bit, because at some point you could have that. But let me redirect that to Margie and ask that question to her. When do investors want to see the value in the disclosure, and when do they want to, like, in other words, we talked about the situation of master leases and other things, and when is just like what disclosure considerations should they be thinking about as they think about that from an investor's perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I've seen a variety of approaches, and um, I think that I think that there are a lot of different ways that that issuers have taken that and have approached it and have been accepted by the market. Again, that I, in my experience working on these, I don't get a lot of questions about, this issuer decided not to disclose the detailed breakdown of value among the master lease components, and I want that. That's not a question that I've ever received.
And if you did have assets that were exposed to wildfire risk or to flood risk, or if we were disclosing that, that might be actually something that would be more important in those situations, because you haven't received the questions, but you could if you ended up with unique assets and people trying to figure out how big of this are these assets that are risky, kind of a thing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let us deal with two issues pretty quickly, so we're almost done with this topic. But I want to talk about title insurance and rata roulette real quickly. And Anna, could you just kind of walk through the city's approach to dealing with title insurance on these transactions?
So for title insurance, typically that is a process that is initiated by our bond counsel. So as early on as we can in the process, bond counsel is going to engage with the title company so they can begin their work. We'll request a preliminary title report, which would then be reviewed with the city attorney's office and may involve us as well. Again, just wanting to make sure we have enough lead time if there's things that are unexpected that pop up that maybe we weren't aware of, or things that we need to address. And I think that's largely our process, handled by bond counsel, whereas other things kind of we may do in-house.
Okay, great. And Anna and Melissa also, like, how expensive is title insurance in your experience?
Yeah, it's based, title insurance is an upfront cost of issuance, right? So it's due at closing, and it's typically driven as a percentage of the par amount of the issue. And so, for smaller transactions, maybe that fee is kind of more acceptable. But as you start thinking about larger transactions, larger issuances, it can be a meaningful component of the cost of issuance. Um, I think, on some of the larger cities that we've worked with, the fee is kind of in and around 0.05% of par. So that gets, for a 10 million, a 10 million transaction, that's 5,000. But for $100 million transaction, that's 50,000, and it keeps going up. So Dan, it can be a meaningful piece of cost of issuance, particular for larger transactions.
Okay, and Margie, do we even need to get title insurance? I mean, is there like, what if, I know that this was the point that John Palmer and I asked, what if, you know, what if we just didn't get it? What would happen?
That is a great question because a lot of and I think you guys talked about this in your last session, but a lot of the municipal market is based on precedent, right? And so if every issuer is getting title insurance on every COP and every lease revenue bond, and you're the one who decides this time you're not going to get it, you're the issuer, what is the investor like? I don't know what an investor is going to tell you. I do know that if you ask investors, um, are you okay? Would you buy this first lease revenue bond without title insurance? They're going to tell you, probably they're going to tell you no, because their incentive is to get you to buy title insurance because it has some, even if it's marginal, level of protection for them. So when they're not faced with an actual bond with actually no title insurance, you're not going to get. I don't think you're not putting their feet to the fire in terms of having to make an actual decision. And so it's a great question. And I would say, if an issuer were to go without title insurance on a transaction, the key would be to disclose what you did instead of getting title insurance. There was a research done by bond counsel or by, the city attorney or whoever the appropriate party is to do that research and determine that the title was clean and or I'm not the right person to for the terminology, but to determine that like this is what we found out, and these are the steps we took, and then the market has evolved on many other things. The market's evolved on reserve funds, which used to be absolutely, on almost every lease revenue bond transactions. And you can see that in some of the big master lease programs where they still have debt service reserve fund, and it evolved away from that. So can it evolve away from title insurance? Is a great question.
Yeah, and just to point out, that, with respect to title insurance, you would have to figure out how you due diligence the title situation so that you weren't running into sort of some known sort of major issue. I think that would be, everybody would consider the due diligence component there. And so I don't quite know how you would do, and there may be ways of doing that we haven't followed, but it is an interesting thing that every single lease revenue bond deal has title insurance, and we don't know if investors would even sort of like impose any sort of penalty if it were gone. It's an interesting area. That doesn't mean we should stop doing it, but it is an interesting area of question of like what, particularly on various deals, is this expense to pay basically for due diligence and an unknown, sort of factor in the market worth it, kind of thing. And so I think it's not something to suggest that we change it, but it's a good point to show that we are, to a certain extent, just doing it on every deal without asking the question, and so sometimes asking the question is valuable in its own right, even if you keep doing the same thing. Let me move on and stay with you, Margie, like with right of relet. First of all, for folks who are not familiar, what is a right of relet?
Yeah, so a right of relet is, and Dan, you can correct me if I don't get the legal terms right, but a right of relet is basically if an issuer stopped paying, the trustee would have the right to take possession of the property and lease it to a different party and use that revenue, the money from the new party's lease payments, to pay the bondholders.
Right, and historically, most deals had right of relet. Over time, a lot of them have not. Does an issuer have to agree to a right of relet in their documents?
Yeah, so this is another area where we've seen a lot of movement away from the right of relet, and some of it was issuers. Uh, some of it was based on the assets, right? We saw. I've seen a number of transactions where the leased asset is like the streets of a city, and obviously there's no ability to for the trustee to take possession and relet those streets to a different party. So some of it's based on the asset, but there are some issuers, highly rated, cities and counties in the state that have just moved away from it. And we disclose that to investors. Um, you know, I we would need to ask them whether they thought on any particular transaction whether there was any kind of penalty, but I think the market has now accepted that a right of relet is not required in a lease revenue bond transaction. Now, if it was a much lower rated entity, then or a certain type of asset, that had a high value in terms of right of relet, or an easier right of relet, not city hall, but now we're not a jail, right? It's kind of that you're unable to do that for a jail, but for a parking garage, would you still does a right of relet would that improve your acceptance by the market? And so I think that there's been an evolution away from right of relet overall. And but if you're talking about a lower rated issuer, or a smaller transaction, or a master lease that has, I mean, we're going to get into master leases later, but one of the challenges with a master lease is that you've set up everything at the beginning, and as the market evolves, so that maybe you don't have to have a right of relet, it's baked into your documents.
Great, and just to make the point that John Palmer made in our last webinar, in the case of the Stockton bankruptcy, the existence of the right of relet meant the city lost the garage during the term of the lease. And so right of relet can be significant. We say that the right of relet can't occur with respect to the jail, but the truth is, legally, we actually don't know what would happen. And could a court interfere with that use and occupancy as a result of that? We just don't know, right? And I'm just interested from the local issuer's perspective, and I know City County San Francisco does not have the right of relet in its documents, but how would you, from an internal perspective, evaluate this discussion of should you have a right of relet or should you not in your documents, in order to make sure that the investment community has what it needs, but also evaluating it from a local issuer perspective?
In our more recent financings, we typically do not have the right to relet. In thinking about it, if you've got, let's say, an operational kind of revenue generating asset like a cruise terminal that needs to be in a certain place, realistically, do you want the trustee coming in and taking that over? Our convention center, I think, just you need to think about kind of the business and operational needs. I already brought up City Hall, just in terms of assets that we would never ever think about that for.
Yeah, and this could be, in the right circumstance, an incredibly traumatic event for a local agency. So it is something that I would just emphasize two things. It's a significant question, and the decision belongs to the issuer. This is not a legal issue. This is a decision that belongs to the issuer to decide what it believes it should have. Running a little bit behind, so I want to sort of speed this up just a little bit. So Melissa, I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about alternative structures, and we've identified, master lease programs. We've talked about them already. We've in our lease revenue bond commercial paper programs, and then project-based leased asset. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what are these different things, and when should folks consider them, and then hopefully we could get some color commentary from Anna and Margie as well.
Yeah, I guess maybe starting with master lease programs and the lease revenue bond commercial paper programs. From our experience with our clients, it tends to be that the larger, more frequent issuers of lease revenue debt will be reliant on a master lease structure as well as a lease revenue commercial paper program. And that's simply because each of those provide a certain level of efficiencies in terms of execution, either on the bond side or the project funding side. Um, and so, for example, a commercial paper program has been really valuable for a city and county like San Francisco, in that they have a large project lists and a lot of different types of projects that have different funding needs at different times. So commercial paper allows them to fund projects at different stages on a just-in-time basis, and then when there's been kind of a culmination of project costs, they take out the commercial paper with long-term certificates of participation. So again, that just gives San Francisco a lot of flexibility and efficiencies in managing a more dynamic, capital funding plan under their lease program. When it comes to the issuance of a long-term bond, there is like a single master lease structure that already has assets kind of leased under the structure that allows for the issuance of additional bonds. So once again, it's kind of not starting from scratch. And there's an existing framework that supports the long-term issuance of bonds. So I think those two alternative structures we work with a lot, but mostly in the context of some of our clients that are larger, more frequent lease revenue bond issuers. For other of our clients that have a single project that maybe they finance every 5 years, right? A commercial paper program becomes less relevant, and a master lease structure may be valuable, or it's just thinking about moving forward with just a kind of a single lease for that particular project or that particular financing. And then, Dan, that's kind of where we get to a project-based lease asset approach, is that, hey, I have this fire station that I need to finance. And by the way, that transaction that we did 3 years ago used all of our city's assets. And so what do I do in terms of financing the fire station today? And that's when we start thinking about, well, maybe we need to use the project that we're financing as the leased asset.
Great. And Anna, what's your perspective on these different alternative structures?
So I'd say, yeah, starting with the commercial paper, the lease revenue bond commercial paper program, I've got an incredible team in the Office of Public Finance here that, manages the day-to-day needs there. We might have 70 different critical repairs projects, with a variety of different departments, and there's, frequent issuances and lots of tracks. So it's a valuable tool for that just-in-time financing and helps us really be able to plan when it's right to issue long-term COPs, or if our real estate department wanted to purchase an asset or buy some land, it can also be very useful to have a commercial paper program. I would, for the master lease, we have one that's been around since 2009 that has grown quite large. So that is advantageous in that the market and the rating analysts, are familiar with it. If you needed to change or wanted to change covenants, would be more of an involved process over time. I mentioned earlier that it's been helpful in terms of if we've got an asset that the market considers to be less essential, for example, the Moscone Convention Center, that was a standalone COP, and we recently refinanced it, brought it into the master lease, and got an upgrade from Moody's related to that component just by doing that. So, but definitely, I would say for frequent issuers, I also a lot of times find value in just a standalone non-master lease. We acquired a garage in Golden Gate Park, and it was for business reasons made sense to have that garage be the leased asset, and it wouldn't be something we would bring into the citywide master lease. We also have a series of COP financings on Treasure Island to fund infrastructure there. We've issued the first tranche, started a new kind of mini master lease for Treasure Island. So definitely advantages, but you need to have a team of dedicated staff that know how to manage these programs and the liquidity renewals and the insurance and all that. Finally, for the project-based assets, we constructed an office permit center office building at 49 South Van Ness. There was a lot of equity in that building. We were able to use our commercial paper. That was something, even though it was still, the construction wasn't complete, it made a lot of sense to use that as the lease asset instead of, putting it under our master lease.
Great, and Margie, let me turn to you, particularly on the project-based lease asset. When do you think that makes sense for local agencies to consider?
So I would say similar to what Melissa said, it's really if there's not another asset or for some reason you want to isolate the risks associated with that project. So maybe there's some kind of a P3 involved where you're trying to associate, basically put a box around the risks associated with that particular project. And I think those are the reasons that a project because you are funding, as she mentioned, you are funding capitalized interest, and there are investors do get very focused on the types of insurance and whether the bondholders or COP holders are beneficiaries, like explicit beneficiaries of different types of insurance policies, and that it does increase the cost of doing a project based lease structure. And so, but there are times when that's very appropriate given the specifics around a particular asset.
Okay, great. So let me turn it now to Anna, and let's actually, Trista, can we do the second poll question? Give this a couple seconds. Give it a few seconds here. So I would say this is kind of a little bit different than I would have thought. I'm surprised. I'm not surprised by the largest being none of the above, but I am surprised by how many have more than one above, which I think is kind of interesting. Okay, great. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move to the next topic, which is rating agencies. Now, let me start out, Anna, with you about, can you talk about what the rating process is from your perspective with lease revenue bonds, and especially how is it different than other rating agency processes that you're used to?
So for we frequently go to the rating agencies for our master lease COP program, as well as GO bonds. The disclosure that we're sending to them, it's the same Appendix A. Obviously, the legal documents for a COP, whether it's a master lease or not, are going to be quite different. The rating analysts, we may have conversations about essentiality and things like that. For Standard and Poor's, we want to always make sure that we've got the earthquake seismic form filled out way in advance, because sometimes it's hard to track down the appropriate party to fill that out at the city. But I would say it's very similar, just for our more bread and butter kind of like general fund lease financings, as it would be, when we're going to them for our general obligation bonds.
Okay, great. And Melissa, can you just kind of generally describe how do the different rating agencies approach lease revenue bonds different?
Yeah, I think I think they each kind of have a base case as Anna described, in terms of they're reliant on kind of their local governmental criteria, each of which is different, but they begin with kind of the issuer credit rating, which is that general obligation bond credit rating. And then from there, they notch, give a lower rating just based on the lease nature of the debt. And so then as we think about that notching from the issuer's just general credit rating to the lease rating, that can be different, and probably for Moody's in particular. And Moody's is focused on the essentiality of the asset that is serving as the lease property. And so, for example, if the asset is City Hall, that's deemed to be essential. But Moody's has a lease commentary, and they note examples of non-essential assets, one of which is like a convention center. And so, convention center debt by Moody's is often notched 2 tiers lower than the issuer's general credit rating. That's not the case with the other credit ratings, or the other rating agencies. They tend just to apply a single notch from the issuer credit rating to incorporate the lease nature of the credit. Anna spoke about Standard and Poor's and their focus on the seismic analysis, and that is a requirement, that you conduct a seismic analysis and fill out a seismic form on any asset that will be serving as the lease property on a transaction. That can be cumbersome, in fact. And for some of these larger organizations, finding the person in the real estate department to fill out the form can be challenging. In fact, I have one client on one transaction that chose not to use Standard & Poor's simply because they didn't have the staffing bandwidth to get all the forms filled out. And so I would say for me, those are the two main differences, and kind of the bees in the bonnet that certain of the rating agencies have. Back in the day, Moody's was very focused on a debt service reserve fund for lease revenue debt, and they're less focused on that now and just more focused on the asset essentiality.
Okay, that's great. Margie, what thoughts do you have for issuers to consider in terms of their rating agency approach?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say a couple things. One is what rating agencies do have a relationship on other credits, or on existing debt. I think a big point of interest, or for investors, is when there's a shift. So say you have Moody's on your existing debt, but choose not to have them on a certain bond issue, then investors start digging a little deeper because sometimes they assume that there's a negative reason for that. But if it's a standalone transaction without a bunch of precedent, then one thing I would say is that there has been a trend over the last 15 to 20 years where issuers utilize fewer ratings per bond issue. So an issuer that used to have 3 ratings may just use 2 now. And an issuer that used to have 2 ratings may just use 1 rating now. And so there may be implications of that. And if an issuer is thinking about using insurance, then there are certain agencies that have relationships with the insurers. So that should all be taken into consideration. But I do think the trend toward fewer ratings may give issuers more flexibility to make changes over time if the and then there's always like rating evaluation services up front, although disclosure council, it depends on kind of what your objectives are in that process, and so I would talk to your underwriter and municipal advisor and attorneys about that one.
Okay, great. Trista, if we can move to the next slide. Now let's move on to the topic. Anna, you've done your deal, and all of the rest of us have abandoned you to the compliance of what it is that we just put in place. Now, let's just start about like overall ongoing management of your lease revenue bonds. What does that look like in the daily life of the city and county of San Francisco?
So one of key things is making sure that we've got the right insurance for all of our leased assets. Each year we work with our risk management department to budget for the insurance to ensure that they've got the information that they need to procure it, especially if there's changes. We also there's annuals, we need to each year obtain like the evidence of insurance and have certifications from our risk manager that will need to go to our trustees under covenants. We also need to have annual certifications that we're appropriating funds for the annual lease payments. We want to monitor the leased assets and make sure that the city still plans on having beneficial use and occupancy in the future, that there's no changes that for tax exempt debt that could impact our tax status, which is common for a variety of financings.
Okay, great. And let's start in that list with what you mentioned first, and I think probably represents the most significant ongoing burden with respect to lease revenue bonds, especially certainly distinct from other kinds of financings, and the casualty and the rental interruption insurance. What are, in general terms, what are the insurance covenants that the city and county of San Francisco have agreed to in its transactions?
Typically it's casualty, 24 months business interruption, and we need to get the title insurance if we're adding assets or substituting assets, and the latter two are things that we can't self-insure for, that we must procure from outside providers. But a lot of the standard things that we talked about here today.
Yeah, in terms of this stuff. And how expensive has that changed over time? How has that expense changed, call it even kind of going back from your prior experience, but talking about like over the last 15 years, how expensive has insurance become relative to what it was before?
I was a banker, so I can't speak to my days prior to joining the city. I think post-pandemic industry challenges, as I mentioned, there was a specific financing, lease revenue bond financing, we were seeing 25, 30% annual growth rates. And, one case went through the substitution process, as I noted. What's interesting actually this year in fiscal 26, our property insurance almost across the board is down from what it was in fiscal 25. So that's exciting for us.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, I think, Margie and Melissa, the vast majority of deals that I have seen just kind of copy and paste in the insurance covenant. And it seems as though it's virtually canon that you have to have 100% replacement cost, 100% replacement value of for casualty insurance. You have a little bit of shelf insurance that comes in that's kind of a little bit of weird conversation about when that can be used and not, depending on what's happening. And then 24 months of rental interruption insurance as, sort of handed down from on high and unalterable in that sense. What if you didn't do it that way? What would happen from a market perspective or a rating agency perspective? What if you said, we're going to do half the replacement value? And let's say we're not going to be crazy and just get rid of insurance altogether. Let's just say we're going to be a little bit, or at least not to begin with. But let's ask the question, what if you say I'm going to do half the replacement value and I'm going to do 12 months of rental interruption insurance? What happens?
That's a great question. I mean, I think one thing we know about the market is that we can't predict reactions to anything really. And so I think when something is as ingrained as rental interruption insurance and 2 years being standard, it's really hard to predict what, because that is one of the things we do find that investors, use to like check a box with. There's no more debt service reserve funds, but they they make sure that there's rental interruption insurance for the 24 months, just given the abatement nature of the lease. Now, looking at what other states do, other states that have lease programs don't have rental interruptions, but don't insurance requirements, but also don't have abatement. So I think it's goes hand in hand with the abatement. So I can't predict the market, but it's a really good question. And I think that investors would have some serious questions.
Yeah, Dan, on the rating agency side, I think we should absolutely have that dialogue, right? When I talked about rating lease revenue bonds, I talked about notching from the general credit rating, and it's not like we're asked for checklists, right? Like from the rating agencies to say, do you have this insurance, that insurance, and that insurance in order for us to rate the lease transaction. And certainly when we're presenting the transaction, we outline the standard insurance coverages. But I'm not, I think it's worth asking the question with your rating analysts is, if we had 12 months of rental interruption, would that materially impact our credit rating? I don't know the answer to that, but we should ask the question.
Yeah, my only contribution to this conversation is just that as Anna noted, post-pandemic, insurance got scary, and the increases were getting positively scary. And I think that one thing that people need to be at least thinking about from a financial perspective is, can I comply with this covenant? And I think that I'm fearful that copying and pasting these insurance covenants into the lease revenue bond deals is leading to people not doing a prospective assessment about whether we really can obtain the insurance that we're getting here. And I'm worried that people are going to go into default if we end up in another round of inflation like that, which we all know is not outside the pale of reasonableness, particularly over the last couple of months, has resurfaced a lot of the inflationary concerns. And so I think one of the things to keep in mind, as Anna mentioned, is that this is an ongoing potentially 30-year requirement to comply with this covenant, and the insurance market could go all around during that. Could as Anna said, in the last, so sort of like in the last 6 years, it's gone all the way up and it's coming back down. It's like the insurance market moves around during the total period, but the covenants don't change. And so it's just making sure that we're being thoughtful and realizing this isn't a legal requirement. None of these insurance requirements are legally required. These are there to make sure that local agencies can get the best financing structure for them, and making sure that they don't agree to something they can't comply with is the one piece there. Melissa, can you just talk briefly about how important are release and substitution provisions in leases, and when do issuers use them and how do they use them?
Yeah, we touched upon this at the start, Dan, and I think they're super important. Like I said, we're making a decision to lease an asset at the start of a transaction, but the debt is outstanding for anywhere from 20 to 30 years, and having that ongoing flexibility for future stakeholders and future management of a city, county, or other agency is just super important. And so, in that context, we always look to ensure that as we're establishing a lease and the underlying legal parameters of that lease, we do allow for the release and substitution of assets. And sometimes even so it's kind of the ongoing management and operations. Um, but there are times where just for strategic reasons, the release and substitution is important. And an agency may be using an asset transfer structure to finance a project. But ultimately, once that project is built and constructed, they want to use the project as the leased asset simply to keep everything in the same bucket, right? And so it is the case where we've presented a transaction to the rating agencies as well as disclosed it into an official statement to say, hey, this is the lease property today, but once our project is constructed, it's our intent to release that property and replace it with the project. So that's also, a priority for clients and agencies, just to align the project with the debt service and the financing as may be helpful to the ongoing operations of an agency.
Yeah, great. And Anna, when are some times you've actually, done substitutions or releases of property?
I'd say in the last 10 years, there's been at least a couple of times. I mentioned the process with the library earlier. So, something that comes up for various reasons, but not very frequently. But I think having that ability to substitute is key. So I greatly value having that.
Yeah, and that's another area we're really good at copying and pasting as well. And I think it's one from as Melissa was talking about, from the local agency perspective, it's a good set of provisions to own. Because the question is, what's required and how do I know that, how do I know that I can comply with this? Who will do what and how hard is it to do? And own that process. And it's not the lawyers will draft it, but it ultimately represents a sizable amount of financial flexibility that the local agency needs to retain and own in that sense, in my opinion. Let me turn to the last question on here and just talk about, if you could just discuss for the last, sort of 5-6 minutes, talking about the investor base for lease revenue bonds. Who are the typical investors and how has that base changed over time? And what are the typical and recurring questions and how have those questions changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So the benefit of California lease revenue bonds have a very broad and diverse investor base, so I think that that benefits issuers greatly. The dominant investors that we've seen over the last few years have been California bond funds. So tax exempt bond funds that that have to have a certain percentage of their assets in California tax exempt instruments, and so they're the most knowledgeable about California lease structures, abatement leases, and the various terms and conditions, and tend to be the largest buyers. Now we have seen an increase in the amount of separately managed accounts, or SMAs, or some people call them professional retail investors, that have invested in California lease structures over time, and that has been a growing base within the municipal market overall for tax exempt bonds, but especially in California. And we've seen a lot of those investors buy leases. Now that has been more of an education process, because those investors, a number of years ago, were dominant in essential service utility revenue bonds, as well as general obligation bonds. So those were the bonds that they kind of understood better. And so it's been a focus of education over time, so that they understand lease revenue bonds and COPs and are willing to make investments in those. But we have seen that increase over time. And we also still see, kind of mom and pop retail investors being important, as well as insurance companies. Insurance companies tend to be on the very highest, only invest in kind of high AA and AAA rated bonds, as well as taxable bonds. So the insurance companies have been more restricted. They also have decreased the amount of tax exempt bonds that they're buying overall. And so I think that the questions you asked about, what questions they're asking, the times where we get the most questions are when there are kind of unique features. Like if there's construction risk, we get a ton of questions about the insurance and the construction risk, and how much capitalized interest there is, and what happens if is there a guaranteed maximum price contract, and they want to know details of the contract, so that they get way into the weeds if there's construction risk. So I think there's definitely, if there's a desire to do a transaction where the project is the leased asset, you're going to get a ton of questions from investors about that. Oh, Dan, I'm not hearing you. I don't know if others can hear Dan.
Sorry, apologies.
Yeah.
Margie, can you just speak over, like, 15 years ago, for example, how was the investment base at that time? And how were deals done 15 years ago, for example?
Yeah, I mean, thinking back to 15 years ago, I think that it was the vast majority of investors were bond funds. It was less of this professional retail, SMA, trust departments, and kind of privately managed money. And so that has the amount that bond funds comprise of the overall they still comprise the largest chunk, but that amount has gone down over time. And also insurance companies were probably a bigger participant back then. Just, they can be cyclical in terms of their ability and amount of assets that they have to invest.
And so, and also, I think most deals were covered by bond insurance too, right?
Yes,
So
yes,
so
pre-financial crisis. Yeah. So
yeah,
that if
and
you look pre-financial crisis, all the, even we were even getting insurance on AA plus rated transactions, which seems crazy now, but anything that wasn't a natural AAA, we would get bond insurance bids, and most of the time they were very inexpensive, and so we insured everything. So there were a lot fewer questions about any of this, because the investors really were looking Yes, at the underlying asset, but then right through to the insurance.
So it's dynamic, and issuers need to be aware of where they sit at whatever time they're going to market to understand who that investor base is. And it does change a lot over time, kind of a question to summarize that. Good. Okay,
Absolutely.
well, thank you all. This was great and a great discussion. And let me turn it back to Robert.
Well, thank you, Dan. It was a great discussion, and we have run out of time. We haven't had any audience Q&A questions, but if you do have some questions and would like us to follow up, go ahead and send those into CDIAC, and we'll follow up, reach out to our presenters and answer your questions. So that's going to close out our program for today. But before we sign off, of course, a huge thank you to Margie Backstrom, Melissa Schick, Anna Van Degna, and Dan Deaton for all of your time in preparing for this series. A great deal of time went into this and sharing your experience on today's program. And then again, I'd like to quickly draw your attention to a few of our upcoming programs, CDIAC. First of all, Municipal Debt Essentials. This is our 3-day flagship program on debt issuance and administration. This is a great opportunity, especially for new or less experienced members of your teams, or people in your agencies that may be tangentially or infrequently involved in the debt issuance or administration process. So in the email that we sent to you with your certificate of participation in session 1, we included a special discount code that will allow new registrants to receive the lowest price for this program. It's a multiple use code, so you can use it for your staff, but it will expire on June 1st. So just wanted to draw your attention to that. Then the 25th annual CDIAC pre-conference to the Bond Buyers California Public Finance Conference is October 14th in San Francisco. I'm currently working on developing our topic and agenda for that program, but I'm planning on another program that challenges public finance conventions. I think it should be very interesting. Full program details as they develop and registration information will be on CDIAC's website. Then finally, if you would, please spend just a few minutes completing our post-program evaluation and tell us what you think. Your feedback is very helpful and very much appreciated. On behalf of our presenters today and all of us at CDIAC, including our education team, Trista Zepeda and Anna Ramirez, thank you all very much for joining us and have a great day.